Okay, this was a new concept for the tables, the first table and the second table, so we had to grapple with the idea of design. So some ideas here, clearly design something to do with understanding your users and their needs. So something that came up in conversation was, first of all, to sort of try and understand in what way the idea of design brings anything new to education. Perhaps this whole idea of users and needs is already there in some way. So what can we add to the idea of design? So some ideas that came up, I took particularly from your input, creativity, methodology. So if you're thinking about teaching through design, you want to have a clearly laid out methodology. So that might link up to issues of CPD. Resilience, sticking to the plan, learning to fail, resolving problems or issues. So design has a certain kind of active empowerment features, perhaps, attached to learning and teaching. Then other ideas that came up were more to do with visualizing where a teaching by design can lead you to. So we had a moment of visualization at the table, trying to imagine if STEAM education was at the center of the curriculum, then what it would be like, or what it would look like. So we had some features coming out, a sense of inclusiveness, inclusion, a sense of diversity, interdisciplinarity, and then this notion that the arts perhaps do recover a more humanistic dimension to learning and teaching. So the whole idea of the arts as a means to express oneself, so to give a voice to pupils. So that brings a whole back to the idea of design, in that sense that what kind of research design is more suited, more appropriate to comply or to respond to these principles.
We had two teams. Team one had three objectives, three purposes. One purpose was that STEAM education provided integrated learning for the holistic learner, to create a holistic learner, integrated learning, holistic learning. The second was that the kind of young person that results from a purposeful STEAM education is those that are independent, they have agency, confidence, resilience, and they can shift identities, problem solve, and that you're looking at developing, again, the purpose of STEAM education is about the whole child, the whole learner for the future. Then Pat Thompson dropped this amazing bombshell, saying, I think the question of purpose of STEAM education is not the right question. She made us think differently when she said we should think, what is the purpose of education first, and then ask, what would the contribution of STEAM education be? Well, that set a whole new agenda for Team 1, who then started saying, well, the objective of STEAM education then would be to provide an opportunity to apply, to make, to design problems, to save the planet, to have a vision, to have aspirations. And the aspirations and the expectations for life's pathways and navigating and positioning chances and choices, taking risks, would be part of what STEAM education purposefully offers. Then Team 1 just left, they dissolved, they went, and Team 2 arrived from another planet. Because they said, Team 2 said, first objective, the purpose of STEAM education is to connect learning, to connect the learner, and in that connection to connect subjects. The second objective was to give permission and abilities and skills to create, to craft, to make, in some cases beautiful things, in other cases not beautiful things. There was quite a thing going on about aesthetics, so we dropped that one for the moment, but that was the second. The third was the biggest time engagement around the meta objective, that it would be a relational objective of STEAM education, is to set a humanistic agenda for education which values and prioritises relational learning of place, space, location, community, identities, connectivity, and that it disrupts mainstream values and that engages young people in a more dialogic way of thinking for a happy life.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of discussion about what, in a sense, what the purpose of science education, first of all, or STEM education was, and the tensions between the idea of it's a body of knowledge or a process, and there was some sense that there was still some fundamental underlying knowledge that had to be learned, but there was a lot of discussion around the outcomes of science and how that could be seen. But in many, there was an acknowledgement that we had to be a bit more tolerant of ambiguity and uncertainty, and that mistakes can be honourable was one of the terms used, and a willingness to take risks. And it got round to creating an environment, the kind of environment that we would like to see science in society should be reflected in the environment that students in classrooms are, to enable them to work through discussion and argument in relation to issues around science and science learning. So that the idea of the extended peer community should somehow be reflected within the way that practice happens in the classroom. So to enable students to have a perception of science that relates to themselves and how they understand themselves in the world. Just running through, but so there was quite a bit of that. But there was a recurrent theme, which was how accountability and assessment tends to dictate what happens in schools, particularly beyond Key Stage 3, I think was the term as we call it, Secondary 2 in Scotland. So Key Stage 3, and it's same idea in Scotland as well, because once you get into that exam timetable, it somehow changes the way that things are done. But nevertheless, there was a view that, if I can find this bit here, that that using arts-based approaches may actually prepare students better for the exam system, if not for the actual knowledge that's required in the exams, because that then gets fed in beyond Key Stage 3. But in terms of confidence, resilience, taking risks, making links between topics, that was a big thing about arts-based approaches, allows links to be made amongst different areas, different disciplines, different subjects. And that led into some idea of what research could be taken to look at that. Does that happen? Because we don't know it does, but there's a feeling that it does. And perhaps a long-term, longitudinal study of the impact of arts-based aspects in STEM, so STEAM. How does it change perspectives, and what happens to those people beyond school? So
Thank you.
Basically.
In some ways it relates to the point that's been mentioned already from Pam's group, which is that in some ways we're not necessarily just talking about STEAM education, we're just talking about what kind of CPD is needed for teachers per se, for the kind of education that we want to have happen. And I think the common thing that came up really in this group was the issue of ownership. You know, again, it comes back to the purpose of it. What's the driver for it? And wanting to get to the point whereby teachers have a sense of value for themselves and also a sense of ownership. So we were looking at what models make that happen. And the big idea, I suppose, that we've talked about is the notion of what would be you know, whether it would be possible to experiment with the idea of a kind of teacher maker space, a teacher creative space, where teachers, in the same way as in the model that Pat was talking about in terms of the TAPE model that she works with, in the same way as Mark was talking about in terms of the American writing program, that teachers actually engage in practices for themselves, and through their delight and discovery in those practices, it starts to rub off in what they want to do in the classroom. So there's a kind of what's in it for them as a human being is what enriches them, and that therefore it's connected with that profound way of being that a teacher then takes back into their practice. Now that's really at the heart of what we want to generate. So we're thinking about, well, what can research do about that? Well, obviously, you know, awareness of programs like that would be useful for schools to have. Being able also to evidence, because the other tension that came particularly from the teacher voice is we need some proof of concept in order to get the permissions to be able to do this kind of stuff. So research needs to help on that. And then also there was a voice in relation to parents and the way in which family CPD might also be a complement to that. So the notion of, you know, could we look at research that might be looking at what kind of space could be there as a resource for children to be engaged in, that could also be there for families to be engaged in, that would also be a place for teachers to be involved in. A little bit like the kind of the everyday creativity fun palace focus that we talked about at the beginning. So I suppose that there's the notion of how might that change, and also looking at the fact that different models and applications might be needed. And might it be that we'd want to work with groups of schools so they've got some sense of strength? You know, Amanda, for example, is in a one-form entry school. So the idea of being part of a community of practice matters. So different models of the ways in which teachers get their sense of belonging and their sense of delight in discovery for themselves.